It is my great pleasure then to introduce to you our keynote speaker for today, Bishop Conley.
Thank you, Dr. Schimpf, and it's a great pleasure. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it back in the back? Good. Well, you've got the bio in front of you, so I'm not going to do a whole lot in that regard as far as introduction go, but I do want to bring greetings from Archbishop Rozansky. I was on retreat with him last week with all the bishops of Region 9, which would be Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. We were all on retreat in California, where it was nice and warm. And I told him I was going to be here, and he said, well, greet everyone for me, and tell him, how happy I am that you're here. So I wanted to give those greetings from the Archbishop of St. Louis. And I think what I'm going to try to do in this time, and I know that Alice wants to keep everything on time here, so I got my little timer here. So I want to just, what I think I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Integrated Humanities Program and my experience of education and how it changed my life. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my pastoral letter, not much because you've got that in front of you, so I'm not going to refer to that too much, but I'm going to make a point in that pastoral letter. That's the second part. And then the third part, I want to try to bring it all home with this basic idea of teaching to the heart and how this is more important today, 2025, than it ever has been in our lifetimes. And that's why the Chesterton Academy movement is so important across the country and others like it. So those are the three parts. So the first part, as you heard, I was a student at the University of Kansas. And my college years were so pivotal that, I've spent most of my priesthood working with college students. I was chaplain at Wichita State University, go Shockers. When I was a young priest, I was chaplain at the University of Dallas Rome campus for 6.5 years. And Alice and John Chesterton were young students before they ever were married, were students of mine. And so that's my connection here. And then I got very involved in teaching at Kansas Newman College in Wichita. And then finally, when I came to the Diocese of Lincoln, we built a Newman Center on the campus of the University of Nebraska, a $40 million Newman Center with a Catholic fraternity about killed me. But we got it built and we got it paid off. And in that Newman Center, we started what we call the Newman Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, which was a continuation of this experience of joy and wonder in learning. And we collaborate with the university so that students who are majoring in degrees like ag science, which is big at the University of Nebraska, or biology, can take courses in the great books and have them receive credits in their undergraduate distribution credits, so that we have a collaboration with the university, so that those who are going to big state schools might have an experience a little bit of what, like a Chesterton Academy provides at a big state university, which is really what happened to me when I was at the University of Kansas. So, so my own story, and my own story is kind of typical in a sense that I came of age in the 70s, and I was kind of a typical kid in the 70s, long hair, just kind of wandering aimlessly throughout this world, and I just by providence landed at the University of Kansas and in this humanities program called the Integrated Humanities Program. And it wasn't anything I pursued with intention. It was, frankly, and I see Tim Klassen here, his father and I were in the school together. And I wasn't a scholar. I wasn't, I frankly hardly read a book in high school. I went to a big public high school in Kansas City, 714 in my graduation class, and I don't think I ever read a book in my high school years. I got through, kind of faked my way through it, and landed at this university program. And probably the reason why I took it was because it satisfied English 101, Speech 101, Western Civ. I could get all those knocked out, those survey courses, which are always very boring, taught by graduate assistants, all in one sweep through this integrated program, which was 6 hours a semester, 4 semesters, freshman and sophomore years. And so that was probably the motives for me getting involved in that. Now, the uniqueness of the program, like I said, it wasn't an honors program or anything. They realized the professors, taught by 3 professors, 2 English professors and 1 classics professor. They had been teaching for years at the university, and they realized that the students who were coming up on campus in the late 60s and early 70s were lacking. In other words, their education was deficient. What can we do to remedy this? And so they created this program, and they used to tell us that this is a remedial program. You guys should have been learning this stuff in high school. Hence, Chesterton Academy. That's what you do. This is the proper place to experience these books, this kind of education, this community. And so they were just doing remedial work for us, they said. You should have had this back in high school. So that's the first point. And the program itself, was a program that appealed to the heart more than the head. Although we read those books and we did study them, and it was intellectually very rigorous. But the important distinction I'd like to make in this first part of the talk is that it was core ad core. It was heart to heart. And through that experience, I eventually became a Catholic, and that's a whole nother story for a whole nother talk. But the motto of the program was Nascantur in admiratione, which is a Latin phrase which is translated, let them be born in wonder. Let them be born in wonder. And I remember going to a college fair when I was a senior in high school with Archbishop Conley. Where is Dr. Semby? Who is now the Archbishop of Oklahoma City, is my best friend. We grew up together. We played baseball on the same team when we were in the 7th grade. That's where we met. My dad was the coach. We ended up being roommates all 4 years in college. We both became priests and we both became bishops, although he's an archbishop, so he's got that over me. But we were at this fair. We were both in high school, and we got this fair, and we saw this brochure, and it had a picture of a typical college kid on the cover, barefoot, long hair, like all of us, jeans, looking up at the night sky in Kansas, seeing the Big Dipper with this motto, let them be born in wonder. Let them be born in wonder. And it was quite intriguing to us. It was kind of avant-garde, you might say. In fact, the professors used to call the program an experiment in tradition. An experiment in tradition. So it was, it's interesting how something very ancient can be very new. Like St. Augustine said, ever ancient, ever new. And it was just edgy enough to get a huge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal grant, which is not any friend of tradition, if you know about the Endowment for the Humanities, to start this program. And it was just edgy enough to get their interest up. And so that's how this program was launched in the fall of 1970, which was the first semester in that program. And I told this story last night to several people that John Sr., who ended up being my godfather and was one of the 3 professors. Sometimes the other professors get lost in the story, but Dennis Quinn was the founder, Frank Nellick, who was another English professor, and John Sr. And John Sr. Was eventually, I asked him to be my godfather, and he, we became very close. But in the early years, he was good friends with Dr. Ronald MacArthur, who was the founding president of Thomas Aquinas College in California. And they were talking about the crisis of higher education in the 60s. Both of them were seasoned professors, and they were interested in sort of renewing sort of the great tradition, intellectual tradition. And Dr. MacArthur, who was the founder of Thomas Aquinas, said, the crisis of education, it's a crisis of reason. Young people aren't thinking correctly and critically. They need logic. They need philosophy. They need St. Thomas Aquinas. And John Sr., and I got these letters, and I was able to see these exchanges, and John Sr. would write back and say, I don't disagree with you, Ron. He says, it's true. He says, but before we can restore the reason, we have to restore the imagination. There's a crisis of imagination. They can't read the great books until they read the good books. And they don't have any poetry. They don't have any music. Their souls are flat because of this pragmatic, utilitarian approach to modern education. And so we need to till the soil of the imagination and bring wonder and love and joy and friendship in learning. And then they'll go off and study philosophy, and they'll go to the higher things. But you've got to start with wonder. And so MacArthur went off and founded Thomas Aquinas College the same year that the Integrated Humanities Program began. And Dr. Senior was actually signed up to be one of the founding professors at Thomas Aquinas. And he decided against that because there was this other program that was just starting up at the University of Kansas called the Integrated Humanities Program. And he was more drawn to that. And so he went there, and that's when the IHP, as we call it, was launched at the same time. So it's interesting how both of these things were happening simultaneously. And the answer is, like so many things Catholic, it's not an either or, it's a both and, right? It's both the imagination and the intellect. But there's something that comes first, and it's the imagination. But they're both important, and they're both sort of the problem with it still is the problem with higher education today, a crisis of reason and a crisis of imagination. So what was unique about this program was that not only did we read the great books, we started with the Greeks the first semester. We read the Odyssey and the Iliad. We read the Greek tragedy plays. We read Plato's Republic. We read Aesop's Fables, which I loved. And then the second semester of our freshman year, we read the Romans. So we started with the Aeneid, the founding of Rome. We read Ovid. We read Caesar's Gallic Wars. The boys really liked that book. High body counts, those kind of things. A lot of blood. And Cicero. We ended up with Cicero. And then the second year, we moved into the Christian era, and we began with selections from the Bible, but as literature, because this is a state university, and you can't teach religion as if it were true. So we read passages from the gospel, and that's the first time I ever really read the Bible. Like, I was raised in a Presbyterian family, but we went to church maybe Christmas and Easter, maybe. But my parents were Christians in a Christian ethos. So there was Christian values instilled in us as we were growing up. But I never really read the Bible. And so for the first time, I started reading the Bible, and we read the book of Job as literature. Marvelous piece of literature. We read the Psalms. We had to memorize the Psalms. And so all of this was happening, in the second year. And we read St. Augustine's Confessions. We read the life of Charlemagne. We read Chronicles of the Crusades. And we ended that first semester of the second year with the Little Flowers of St. Francis of Assisi. I didn't know who a saint was. These were beautiful little stories of these wonderful Franciscans and St. Francis and his companions, which is considered classic literature. That's part of the great book's canon, the Little Flowers of St. Francis, written back in the Middle Ages. And then the second semester of the second year, so the last semester, the fourth semester, we began with the Canterbury Tales and Don Quixote. And Don Quixote became sort of the symbol. In fact, if you go to the University of Kansas, we had a big memorial put up on campus, and it's a bas-relief of Don Quixote on a horse jousting with the windmills, and a quote from Cervantes. That became sort of the emblematic image of the Integrated Humanities Program. Who beginning the dawn of the modern world. And through that last semester, we read Shakespeare plays, and we read the philosophers, David Hume, Descartes, John Locke, the Enlightenment philosophers, Newman, which was huge, John Henry Newman, Dickens, the novels of Dickens, and we ended up, that last book was The Oregon Trail, really American, frontier spirit. So that was the corpus, that was the canon of the books, and they were great books, and but that was part of the program. You know, I used to tell people that I read my way into the Catholic Church, but it's much more than that. I loved my way into the Catholic Church because it was a conversion of heart. Because in addition to reading these books, so 3 hours a week were lecture, 2 lectures, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then the rest of the course was divided up into 3 one-hour sections where you had smaller, there were 150 in my first class, it was a big lecture hall. And the 3 professors sat up at the front and they lectured, and you couldn't take notes. You had to have your desk clear. They wanted you to look at them and listen and not scribble down, is this going to be on the test? They hated tests, which we kind of liked that idea. But we didn't like tests either. And they gave oral exams because they could find out in 10 minutes how much you knew. And they were very, very rigorous oral exams. But we couldn't take notes, so we just had to listen. And we couldn't ask questions. It was just, and every class began with a song. So it would be an upperclassman who would come out, a junior or senior, usually a girl, usually very pretty. So the guys were just sort of, and she'd have a guitar, and we would learn these songs, like these great folk songs, like Home on the Range. We were in Kansas. That was the first one we learned. My Old Kentucky Home, Believe Me If All Those Endearing Young Charms, Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, all these English ballads. Beautiful. So they were building up this repertoire of music. Little did we know. And then, of course, when we would be outside of class, we'd start singing these songs to each other, right? So we had that for every lecture. And then 1 hour a week was poetry memorization. So we just memorized reams and reams of poetry. We didn't know what they were. I had a clue. I think your dad was one of the ones that drilled us on poems. You know, they were all kinds of poems. British poems weren't necessarily Catholic. Very few were actually Catholic. And then in addition to the poetry, we'd all go out into the countryside and we would at night learn the constellations of the stars. And that was just to get us to look up and look out and to wonder. And we were reading the Greek myths, so we knew all of the mythology behind the stars, and we would identify these constellations who were always attached to myths. And they used to say that we teach by the muses. And so the 9 muses in Greek literature, as we know, are the 9 muses of memory. And so they were trying to get our memories activated because we had been so dulled from television and all this other stuff. Me, rock and roll. I was a big Grateful Dead follower. That's another story. Anyway, so we had all of this, and so this was 1 hour. Then 1 hour we spent in discussion, and 1 hour we spent in rhetoric. We had to stand up in front of like maybe 15 of our students and talk about the book and argue, let's say, for the book or tell the story or something like that. So they get us out of ourselves to kind of say, okay, what do you know about this? You know, give a persuasive speech on this. So that was how the 6 hours all fit together. In addition to those, we also had community events. So in the fall, we would put together what we call the Yankee Tank Fair. It would be out in the country. The women would bake all this food. We would have music, and actually I played in this band that was on the stage for playing music. By that time, I wasn't playing Grateful Dead. It was like folk music and that kind of thing. And then we would have contests, out in the country, like greased pig contests or pile driving contests, those kinds of things. And then in the spring, which was the highlight of the year, we would have a formal waltz. And we would have, the men would have to rent tuxedos, and the girls would have these long, beautiful gowns. We'd rent out the university ballroom, hire the university orchestra, have a live orchestra of students, and we'd have like 5 Straussian waltzes. Now, of course, nobody knew how to waltz. So we'd have 2 months of waltzing lessons. Once a week, we'd have to go and learn how to waltz, so we wouldn't be klutzes out there. And when you get your dance card, you'd have 5 different ladies on your dance card, and you'd have to go to a table, a round table, find out who it is, escort her out onto the dance floor, dance a waltz, escort her back to the table, and do the next waltz for the whole evening, 2 hours of dancing. And this was to help the students, the men to become gentlemen and the women to become ladies. And it just lifted us up. It was magical and romantic, my gosh. You can imagine the romance, these 18, 19, 20-year-olds. It became magical. And that's why I said it was the highlight of the year. Everybody looked forward to the waltz and the after-waltz party and the after-party waltz and all this kind of, into the wee hours of the night. We're in college, right? You don't go to sleep on the weekend. And so it was a combination of all of these things that really did cause a rebirth in wonder. And for a lot of us, it was a birth. It wasn't a rebirth because we never had wonder in our souls. And so that was kind of the cumulative effect of all of that experience, which became a conversion of the heart. So that's the first part. Let me check my time here. Okay, we're good. So I'm going to go into my conversion. But it was, over the course of 15 years, there were over 300 conversions to the Catholic faith through this program. So much so that some of the parents, one of my classmates, Jeannie Bangs, her dad was a Unitarian minister, and this was a time when there were cults on campuses, like the Moonies and the Hare Krishnas, and so her father thought she was being brainwashed by these professors, and so they filed a suit against the University of Kansas, and they got the American Civil Liberties to join the suit, and the Jewish Defense League, because a lot of the converts were Jews, and they accused the professors of proselytizing in a university. And it was on the front page of the Kansas City Star for 3 days. And they had hearings. And the dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who was a close friend of Dennis Quinn and Frank Nellick and John Sr., knew this was ridiculous, but they had to go through it. They ended to throw it out because there was no evidence. If you did, like I remember going to John Sr. once and saying, hey, I'm kind of getting interested in the Catholic Church. He said, well, go talk to the priest. We're not in the religion business here. Now, he eventually became my godfather, but they were very clear that they're not teaching religion. They're teaching truth, goodness, and beauty through literature, art, music, poetry, architecture, and dance. And it just sort of, when you start to connect the dots, it leads you to God and those questions. Where is he? What do I do? What do I believe about good and evil? About life and death, about love, and all these kinds of things, and it leads you right to the Catholic Church. And it was not premeditated on their part. In fact, they weren't even all Catholic. The third professor, Dr. Nellick, he converted quietly along the way. So it wasn't any kind of intentional program to make Catholics. Well, during this whole period of time is when I converted to the Catholic Church. And of course, my mother was fine because I got my hair cut and I quit listening to the Grateful Dead. At least she thought I quit listening to the Grateful Dead. And that I got religion. But my dad, they had a different attitude about it. He thought that, well, I've given up my freedom. He says, you've given up your freedom to think on your own. Now the Catholic Church is going to make all your decisions for you. You can't think for yourself anymore. And so I got in this big argument, and we get in arguments with him. Fast forward, I'll tell this little bit, fast forward 15 years, I'm a priest, 5 years, my mom writes me this letter, your father and I have decided to become Catholic. And so we want you to receive us in the church, and so we find out that they've been baptized. So I baptized, confirmed them, and gave their first Holy Communion when I was a young priest. So that's... And I wasn't the only student whose parents converted. Or these 300 that converted from the program married and their spouses converted, and just the ripple effect, just kind of spread. That was really my experience of the humanities program. Now, the second part, I want to refer to my pastoral letter a little bit, because as you can imagine, this experience that I had in college shaped everything in my life. My whole view of education, of learning, of faith, of spirituality, and eventually led me to the priesthood. And so that was a profound, so I've always been reflecting on it. And so this last year I wrote a pastoral letter. I tried to capture in this pastoral letter a little bit of my experience, because we are undergoing a great renewal, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, in our Catholic schools throughout the country. Not just Chesterton movement, but in the Catholic schools. I did a webinar for 25 diocesan superintendents of schools, Catholic school systems throughout the country, and basically on this. And they're very interested. They're all younger than me, so they're very interested in this whole movement of being reborn in wonder and education to the heart. And so I just want to just turn to page, if you've got it in front of you, turn to page 2. And I kind of talk about this a little bit in the context of what can we do now in education, practically, because I have 24 elementary schools and 6 high schools in my diocese. So that's a big school system, 6,000 kids. So how can I somehow bring this idea and vision to a large school system? You know, the smaller schools like Chesterton, they've been doing a great job. They're leading the way. The homeschooling movement is kind of leading the way. So how can we take a page out of that playbook and apply it to a larger system? So down at the bottom of page 2, I'll just read this. I'm quoting myself, so I'm really saying this. I'm not quoting anybody. This is me. Being reborn in wonder. I am not one of the millions of children who received a Catholic education in this country. Nor was I Catholic when I showed up as a freshman at the University of Kansas in the early 1970s. My main interests at the time were basketball and the Grateful Dead, and KU had both of them. But God had other designs in my first year, and I providentially enrolled in the Integrated Humanities Program. By the middle of my junior year, I was baptized and received into the Catholic Church. If I were to distill what converted me down to one thing beyond the power of supernatural grace, it was a great book's liberal arts education. Liberal arts has become a controversial term, but it simply denotes an education meant to free the student for truth. Liberal, of course, coming from the Latin liber, which means free, to be free. To be free from error, to be free from distortion, to see clearly, to be able to live as we're created to live. Because it's only sin that restricts us from our true freedom and error and falsehood. To be free is really the goal of all education. So my liberal arts education lived up to its name, immersing students in truth, goodness, and beauty through poetry, history, music, philosophy, theology, art, architecture, and dance. This spurring of my imagination ultimately led to my conversion to the Catholic Church, which was hastened through my classmates' friendships and our mutual love and desire for these 3 transcendentals. And then I quote Newman, and I want to give a little bit of context for this quote, because this is very important. So I was really influenced by John Henry Newman, and he's a famous convert from the 19th century, an Anglican professor who right in the middle of his career, right in the height of his career, converts to the Catholic faith, has to give up everything. You couldn't be a Catholic at Oxford at that time. You can now. But he had to give up his professorship. He was a Don. He was one of the bright lights, the leader of the Oxford movement, a huge movement in England. Gave it all up in 1845 to become a Catholic, to start all over again. Huge sacrifice, but he knew that that's what he had to do. So shortly after his conversion, he got into a public debate with Sir Robert Peel, who was a member of Parliament. And this was the height of the Industrial Revolution in England. Factories were going up everywhere. You know, they're churning out workers. Dickens wrote about the plight and tragedy of child labor. They created child labor laws to protect children because they were working 16 hours a day in these hideous factories. It was all this drive, this industrial revolution. And Newman saw this as a disaster. And so he got into this debate because Sir Robert Peel, who was the member of Parliament, said the liberal arts, we don't need the liberal arts anymore. because we need workers and we need producers and consumers. And he said, the liberal arts are worth nothing. You know, they don't produce, they're not practical. And so he was all for doing away with the liberal arts. And so Newman got in this public debate. Newman loved a good debate, and it was in the London Times, letters. They were big letter writers in Victorian England, so there were letters back and forth, and they published these letters. And eventually they were put into a book called the Tamworth Reading Room Lectures, or Letters. And Newman was arguing for the importance of the liberal arts to form the whole person, to form the whole person. If you want workers, machines can do that. But we are forming the whole person. And so we can't give up the liberal arts. And so this debate went on. And so one of Newman's, and I'll quote a longer portion of this, but he says, after all, and this will kind of cause Thomists to squirm. I actually used this line in my commencement address at Thomas Aquinas College in 2023, and I just let it sit there. After all, man is not a reasoning animal. And they're looking like, what did he say? Man is not a reasoning animal? After all, man is not a reasoning animal. That's Newman. He is a seeing, feeling, contemplating, acting animal. He is influenced by what is direct and precise. And he goes on to talk about science and how important it is. Newman was all about science. He was all about the STEM. When he started the university in Ireland, he had a medical school planned. So he wasn't an enemy of the sciences. He says, science gives us the grounds or premises from which religious truths are to be inferred. But it does not set about inferring them, much less does it reach the inference. That's not its province. It brings before us phenomena, and it leaves us, if you will, to call them works of design, wisdom, and benevolence. And further still, if we will proceed to confess an intelligent creator, we have to take the facts and give them meaning and draw our own conclusions from the scientific data. He's talking about the sacramental imagination. What do we do with all this physical reality? And I'll talk about this at the end, how important nature is. So he said, first comes knowledge, then a view, then reasoning, then belief. This is why science has so little of a religious tendency. Deductions have no power of persuasion. Then this is the money line here. And this can kind of sum up my whole talk. And that's what I quote right here. You can read along with it. And this fits into our theme perfectly. The heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us. Many a man will live and die upon a dogma. No man will be a martyr for a conclusion. End of quote. So as I go on to say, when I discovered truth, goodness, and beauty in the great books described by Matthew Arnold as the best that's ever been thought and said, wonder took hold within me. This was a happy accident. The 3 KU professors who founded the Integrated Humanities Program firmly believed that a true education should engender, quote, a birth of the human spirit, an entry into a new world that excites interest because it is seen in the light of wonder. It's a quote from Dennis Quinn. Then he goes on to say, wonder is the beginning of knowledge, said Professor John Sr., another co-founder. Quote, the reverent fear that beauty strikes within us. It's a beautiful definition of wonder. The reverent fear, because there is a certain kind of fear. A reverent fear that beauty strikes within us. It's like when we meet a girl and we fall in love. were afraid. A man is shaking in his boots because of this beauty and this wonder. The idea is so central that they chose the Latin phrase nascantur in admiratione, let them be born in wonder, as the program's model. As I was reborn in wonder, my heart began to sing for joy. St. Augustine wrote, only the lover sings. And ultimately, I discovered love himself through the joy and wonder suffused through a liberal arts program. Although the Integrated Humanities Program was not Catholic, it led to around 300 conversions in the decade or so that it lasted. Such is the power of truth, goodness, and beauty, which have always been at the heart of our faith. If an explicitly secular program could be so powerful, imagine the impact of a Catholic education. But this raises the question, what makes an education genuinely Catholic? And at that point, I go into, and I won't go into this, but at that point I talk about the 5 marks of what is an authentic Catholic school. And I think that the Chesterton Academy has all 5 of these. Very briefly, inspired by a supernatural vision, founded on a sound Christian anthropology, animated by communion and community, imbued with a Catholic worldview. That is, the curriculum is cross-pollinated. I'm a beekeeper, so I like the idea of pollination. The subjects are cross-curricular. They're integrated and de-siloed. And they're sustained, finally, the 5th one, sustained by a gospel witness modeled by discipleship. Those 5 marks are not mine. Those are Archbishop Michael Miller's, who, when he was working for the Secretary for Catholic Education in Rome, the Congregation for Catholic Education, developed these as the 5 marks of an authentic Catholic school. And as you look at those, you see that they're not there in most of our Catholic schools. You know, we've been trying to keep one foot in the public school arena and one foot in the Catholic school arena, and we've been trying. You can't do that. You know, we have our own tradition, and we need to embrace it and be proud of it. And because we invented schools. I mean, the first universities were started by the church, by the religious communities, you know. So we don't have to take a page out of the public school. And we have a better system and can be more effective by being true to what we understand as Catholic education with these 5 authentic marks. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do in this pastoral letter. And you can read it on your own or not if you don't want to. But I think that those of you who are interested in this kind of education, you see it in your children right now, the ones that are studying at the academy, at the Chesterton Academy, because it kind of embodies all of that. So finally, my conclusion, I'll kind of land this plane if I can, the 3rd part. Obviously, a lot of this has to take place at home. We can have the very best schools, and if families are not supporting this, then it can be all unraveled, because parents are the first and primary educators of their children. They learn most at home. We're just coming along to kind of supplement that and help it along and give parents guidance and help. But it has to happen at home. And so engaging families in the education of their children is so important. And that's probably our biggest challenge, especially when you've got a big school system like I do, where you've got 6,000 students and all their families who are all over the place with regard. Some of them aren't even going to church, right? Just dropping their kids off at the Catholic school, hoping that the church can do the religion for them. And then they come and say, I spent all this money on Catholic education, and my kids aren't going to Mass. You know. Is it the fault of the church? Well, sometimes it is if the schools aren't good. But it's also the responsibility of the parents. You know. And so that's why really education starts at home. And, you know, no school can supplement what parents can do. And I'd like to make a reference to a couple of books that just came out. One of them this summer called The Anxious Generation, which is by an educational psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. And he talks about the impact of technology on the mental health of young people. Now, the second pastoral letter I wrote was on my own struggles in the area of mental health, which led me to eventually take a leave of absence because I began to struggle with anxiety and eventually depression. And I was diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic with major depressive disorder. So from 2019 to 2020, I like to say I took a leave of absence in 2019 for health reasons, and then the whole world took a leave of absence in March of 2020. But I try to tell that story in that future with hope. And, you know, I wrote that to kind of help others who are struggling with mental health issues, because I know that your children are part of this generation. I know that if your children aren't struggling, well, then maybe you know families that are struggling with their children, because the rate of mental health issues is going up among this generation. And he looks at Generation Z, Gen Z, anybody that's 30 years old or younger. And he contrasts, and this is where it's all tied together, he contrasts a screen-based childhood with a play-based childhood, saying that the screen-based childhood has replaced, for the most part, a play-based. And when he talks about a play-based childhood, he talks about not only play outside, which is very important, real encounter with nature, but real friendships, face-to-face, real things. As John Sr. used to say, the really real. He used to talk about that. We said, what is he talking about? Isn't that kind of redundant? No, the really real, meaning real encounter. And if everything is on the screen and everything is in your head, well, eventually it's going to cause a problem. Because when you deal with the real world, which you have to eventually, you're not prepared. And that's what's happening with the generation coming up, is they're not prepared to deal with reality because they've been in their heads. Chris Stefanik says, the mind is a scary place like a forest. Never go in alone. And it's true. They've been alone in their own head in front of a screen. And so a second book, which is I just discovered, and it's actually been out for 20 years. It's called Last Child in the Woods. Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, L-O-U-V. And he's a naturalist, and he's all about state parks and national parks and environment. But he has this great understanding that there is a nature deficit disorder among this generation. Now, he makes that term up. That's not a clinical, you don't have to look it up in the psychology. It's not a clinical term, but it might be someday. But he said we're suffering from a nature deficit disorder, meaning that children are not experiencing what normal kids do when they grow up. Like, he has a whole chapter on building tree forts. Now, how many children build tree forts? I built tree forts when I was growing up. A lot. That was fun. You know, and going out into the woods and those kinds of things. That's why it's called Last Child in the Woods. But he also says that this can also be experienced through reading. He says, reading about nature with a child is another way, as an adult, to revive a sense of natural wonder. Unlike television, and this was before the smartphone. So he wasn't even talking about the smartphone. He's talking about television. Unlike television, reading does not swallow the senses or dictate thought. Reading stimulates, I love this line, reading stimulates the ecology of the imagination. Reading stimulates the ecology of the imagination. Can you remember the wonder you felt when you first read The Jungle Book, or Tom Sawyer, or Huckleberry Finn? We're right here on the Missouri River, which is great. So all this took place. Kipling's World Within a World, Twain's Slow River, the feel of freedom and sand on the secret island and in the depths of the cave. Environmental educators and activists repeatedly mentioned nature books as an important childhood influence. So this is where the two come together, mental health and a sound liberal arts education, which has a healthy element of natural experience. One of the things he laments is the disappearance of natural sciences in the universities. Everything's in a lab now and under a microscope. So it used to be you would go out and identify plants and trees and animals. And that those courses have been decreasing at universities so that, everybody is in their head and not out looking at nature, which is, again, the sacramental imagination. The nature speaks because the Creator, we believe that God created all things. So the fingerprints of God are everywhere. That's why the STEM courses are so important. Physics, chemistry, biology. And the greatest scientific leaders in the history of Western civilization have all been believers. Louis Pasteur was a devout daily masser. He's the greatest biologist of the 19th century. Father Lemaitre was a Jesuit priest who developed the Big Bang Theory, which still has not been disproven. So there's no, Bishop Barron talks about the disaffiliation among this generation, how science, if you believe in science, then you can't be a person of faith, or you believe in faith, you can't believe in science. Somehow they've separated, which is ridiculous. There's no dichotomy there. They should complement each other and mutually enhance each other. So that's why science is very important. And it's all part of this whole education of the whole person. And so these kinds of things, I think, are also the antidote to the mental health crisis that we have. That's why, just recently, our governor in Nebraska, Governor Jim Pillen, who's Catholic, by the way, he is in his State of the Union, he wants to ban cell phones in all K through 12 public schools. Now, that's pretty bold. And we don't even have it in the Catholic schools. So I told my superintendent, we got to do it before he does it, because I don't be following the public schools. We should be leading, and they've already done it in the New York system. They've already done it to the New York schools because of gang-related stuff, and all this thing. So technology, we've got to get a handle on it. It's not going away, and we can't hide from it. AI is just on the horizon. That's why parents, more than ever now, have to take an active and intentional role in the use of technology for their children. We can use it. I got to use it. I got this thing, it's like attached to my hip. But we have to manage it, or it'll manage us, especially AI. Not the Augustine Institute, but artificial intelligence. So that's how it all comes together. And the fruits of what has happened through my experience, for example, I was one of the founders, on the founding committee of Wyoming Catholic College, which has implemented a lot of this. St. Gregory's Academy, a boys' school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, St. Martin's in Fort Scott, Kansas, and Clear Creek Monastery. All of the founding monks at Clear Creek were classmates a couple years before or after me, who founded that monastery. It's a thriving monastery. They're having to start a second foundation. So it's working, and it's beginning to have an effect across all kinds of areas. Finally, last point, and we'll have a little bit of Q&A. The Chesterton Academy movement is really interesting because I first heard about Dale Alquist because I was teaching a course in Rome after UD for Christendom College. And I was teaching their moral theology course because that was my degree, was in morals. And one of my students was Julian Alquist. And he was a sophomore at Christendom College doing the Rome program. And he was telling me about his dad. And my dad, he really loves Chesterton. And I was like, oh, wow, that's great. Chesterton had been. I started reading Chesterton too on my path to the Catholic Church. Yeah, and he's got this idea of starting a school, and I might come back when I finish and help him. So they opened the first Chesterton Academy in 2008 in Minneapolis, St. Paul. They opened the second one in 2010 in Minneapolis, St. Paul, because the first one was they outgrew it. Last year, they opened up the 46th Chesterton Academy. This year, they will have opened 78. that's how that movement is spreading across. We just started, I didn't, but the Archdiocese of Omaha started one 2 years ago, a little bit after you guys started. So this is starting, to catch on, and I think that that's a great sign of hope. And I'm going to end with this. Really, I'm going to end with this. I know I've said that 3 times. Okay, I'm going to end with this. So somebody asked Dale Alquist, why do you read the great books? What good are, sort of like Robert Peel, what good is a liberal arts education? Why do we read these books? Why is it important? These kids got to get trained to get jobs and work. How are they going to, my dad, when I told my dad I was majoring in English literature, he says, what are you going to do, open up an English shop? How are you going to make any money? He's very pragmatic, he fought in World War II. He's a very pragmatic guy. So Alquist, when he was asked this, why do we read the great books, he answered this way. We read the Iliad because all life is a battle. We read the Odyssey because all life is a journey. We read the book of Job because all life is a riddle. We read the Canterbury Tales because all life is a pilgrimage. We read Don Quixote because all life is a knight errantry. We read Shakespeare because all the world's a stage. We read Dickens because all life is a great expectation. We read Dostoevsky because we're all part of a family, and every soul is a battleground between heaven and hell. We read Dante because all life is a divine comedy. And we read Chesterton because all life is a paradox. Thank you. How are we doing on time? 11:10, right? Alice.
So I think we would like to leave you a little time before our 11:30 breakout session. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions, which means you can't hold for the link, short and sweet. Bishop, why is Ripple your favorite Grateful Dead song? And things like that. So put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone.
I've got a question straight away, because I've heard it from a few people that I know from Tom's Aquinas as well. Why is Don Quixote such an emblematic figure? It seems like a person who gets lost in his imagination, puts a lot of people out, converts on his deathbed, and then now that's a good example. What is it about Don Quixote?
Great question. Well, the whole story is a romance. Of course, there's love, and there's betrayal, and there's all the human emotions are in that story. But he is a figure who was certainly a romantic, so he was totally impractical. He's kind of the worst example of what this education should be, totally impractical. I mean, he thought that windmills were dragons, and he would come up and he would talk to this windmill. But why it's emblematic is because the windmill represented the modern world. And he was really kind of railing against what he saw as the beginning of the modern world. Now, again, you have to take that with a grain of salt because we're way beyond windmills, right? But one of the things the professor said, it's just the idea that man is made for greater things, and so he's all about knight errantry, and about chivalry, and about respect and honor and loyalty and all these kind of things. All these virtues are in those stories. Now, he himself was a crazy guy, right? He was. I think he was insane. I think he was. But he shows us that we have to have this valiant spirit and not be undaunted, by the rise of all of these sort of mechanical things in our world. That's why it's emblematic.
More questions? I'm going to go to the back of the room to be fair.
By the way, the reason why Ripple is a Grateful Dead song, because it was the most kind of acoustic of their songs.
How do we as parents foster an appreciation for this type of education? and counter the pushback that, at least we do, that they're missing out on regular public/regular Catholic high school education, and kind of let go and leave into this. Make the most of the experience.
Very good, very good. Yeah, that's going to be the resistance, because they're going to see all their friends, right? But Mom, why do we have to do this, I want to go do this. That's going to be hard. But I think by modeling it at home by yourselves, how do you use technology? They're keen observers, right? If you spend a lot of time in front of a screen and they see that, they're going to say, well, that must be okay, And I have to think about that myself, because I spend a lot of time in front of a screen. But, that's how you model it. So what you're doing at home, like reading with your children, there's no better thing than experiencing things with your children. Going for a walk, taking them out, going on a vacation where you spend a lot of time outside, and maybe you don't like hiking, maybe you don't like, being outside, but do it for them. But reading aloud, especially at lower levels, but even in high school, is a great thing. And read things with them. If they're reading a book, let's say here at Chesterton, well, you read along with them, and then you can ask them, hey, what did you think about this character? In other words, and I think it goes a long ways to really show them that you're really interested in what's going on in their lives. I want to know what makes you happy and what makes you sad. I want to know what makes you excited or makes you, fearful. And that's hard for parents because we're so busy doing all kinds of other things. But to really be in their lives is really what I think the best thing. Hope that helps someone.
You were mentioning earlier, Bishop, that liberal arts education, that terminology is somewhat charged, right? And I wonder if you'd like to speak a little bit about it, expand that a little bit, where you see it charged up, and I'll offer this as maybe a point of reflection. I think that frequently you come up with a mindset among parents who maybe have no experience of this kind of education, frequently come, well, why would we go into X, Y, and Z? It's not STEM, it's not whatever, right? So there's a kind of a fundamental kind of tipping towards materiality, right, at the back of things. So I want in that context, we talk a little bit about what you think is going on with the controversy around the concept of liberal arts education and language.
Okay, that's a great question because I've talked to employers when they're doing interviews. It's hard to find employees. We have unemployment so low now that, to find good workers. And I talked to a CEO of a big company in Lincoln, and when he interviews employees for a variety of positions in the company, he will take somebody who can carry on an intelligent conversation, can make references that shows that he's well read, can speak in complete sentences and look him in the eye. He will hire that person over, let's say, somebody that's been a straight A student in technology, and they've got they're really skilled in kind of a specific thing. He wants somebody that can relate on a human level. And in an interview process, those kinds of candidates who are applying for jobs are much more marketable than somebody who can't really carry on a conversation. May be very bright, but don't have those human skills, those soft skills, that employers are looking for. So I think in a way it's kind of ironic or paradoxical that I think the most practical kind of education is a liberal arts education.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so it needs to be profound, earth-shattering, no pressure. Oh, so many hands up, okay. Bert and Miss Lamb, who are you pointing towards? All right, this is Pagano.
Sorry, you can, and you guys can ask me questions afterwards.
I'll try to keep this short. So I was one of the lucky ones who was homeschooled and got to have that classical education growing up. And dance, be out in nature, and all those wonderful things, and I'm raising my kids that way. I didn't want to ask you about the flip side of the danger of we raise our kids, form them, give them all this rich beauty and that kind of thing. how do we also guard against a sense of people who didn't receive this are lesser, are missing something, like we pity them or that kind of thing? How do we avoid that and guard against that side too while we're giving them this rich and beautiful education?
Yeah, I think of, I was talking about this yesterday with I spoke to the Augustine Institute students. There were 27 graduate students. And they asked a question like that because they're getting this education, but all their peers are like on a different planet. And I said, I think that if you simply are confident in what you believe, joyful and normal, that they will see something that they don't have. And for example, on the campus of the University of Nebraska, which is a big secular university, crazy stuff going on. We had 42 kids come into the Catholic Church at the Easter Vigil. At Texas A&M, they had 84 last year. We already have 90 in the OCIA program now. So I think, and part of this is focused missionary work on campuses, but part of this is that the landscape out there for young people today is such a wasteland. And they're looking at what the world is saying, this is going to make you happy, this is going to bring you purpose and contentment. And they say, are you kidding me? I'm not fired up about that. And then they meet someone who's full of joy, who's, as we used to say, got it all together, who's got a winning personality, and who's joyful and confident. I want that. I don't have that. So I think that's where evangelization takes place. And that's where our kids, your kids, who are going to go off out of here and into colleges and out into the world, have to have this confidence that all they have to do is just live their faith well. And that will have an evangelizing effect on people around them because it's the only show in town. I mean, we have to be confident of that. Not arrogant, like you say, don't pity them, and not saying like I'm holier than thou or I'm better or you're deficient, but just live your faith well and authentically, and people will be attracted to it. Thank you very much.